Every morning, millions of people pour cornflakes into a bowl without a second thought. A simple breakfast. Golden, crunchy, innocent. But behind that quiet crunch lies a story of obsession, control, and a hatred so deep it tore a family apart. This is not a story about cereal. This is the twisted story of the Kellogg brothers. In the late 1800s, John Harvey Kellogg was a man obsessed with purity, a respected doctor, a health reformer, a man who believed pleasure was evil. He controlled diets, bodies, and minds at his Battle Creek sanitarium. To him, food was not enjoyment, it was discipline. Working silently beside him was his younger brother, Will Keith Kellogg. Will was different, practical, curious, business-minded. While John preached morality, Will worked in the shadows cleaning, experimenting, perfecting, and one night, by accident, they created something new. Wheat flakes. Later, corn flakes. It should have been a shared victory. Instead, it became the beginning of war. John Harvey claimed the invention as his own. He believed the flakes were part of his moral mission: bland food to suppress desire. Will saw something else. Not control, but possibility. A product the world would love. As cornflakes grew popular, so did the tension. John tightened his grip. He forbade sugar. He forbade change. He forbade Will from dreaming beyond the sanitarium walls. But resentment ferments quietly. Will eventually do the unthinkable. He left. He added sugar. He started his own company, and the cereal empire exploded. Millions of boxes sold, fortunes made, and then lawsuits. Brothers sued brother. Words turned to poison. Family turned to strangers. They never reconciled, not once. With his success, Will built a mansion, grand, elegant, towering. But this was no happy ending. The walls were thick with bitterness. The wealth was loud, but the silence between brothers was louder. John lived the rest of his life rigid, isolated, convinced he was right. Will lived wealthy, admired, but forever marked by the price of betrayal. Two brothers, one invention, an empire built on flakes and hatred. So the next time you sit down for breakfast, listen carefully, because even the quietest foods can carry the loudest secrets, and some stories never stop whispering. Every morning, before the world fully wakes up, the same ritual repeats itself. A bowl placed gently on a kitchen table. Milk poured slowly, golden flakes floating quietly on the surface. Corn flakes. They arrive without warning, without drama, without fear. A breakfast trusted by parents, doctors, schools, and entire generations. A food wrapped in sunshine colors and smiling promises. Healthy, clean, safe, or so it seemed. Because some of the darkest stories in history never announce themselves with violence. They arrive softly. They hide behind routines. They live in habits so ordinary that no one ever questions them. Cornflakes were never meant to be exciting. That was the point. In the late 19th century, America was changing rapidly. Cities were growing louder. Factories worked longer hours. People ate heavy, greasy breakfasts, meat, alcohol, fried food. Doctors worried the nation was losing its moral compass. Illness, temptation, and corruption were blamed not just on society, but on food itself. And into that fear stepped a man who believed breakfast could control the human soul. John Harvey Kellogg. He did not see food as nourishment. He saw it as discipline. To Kellogg, pleasure was dangerous. Desire was sinful. The body was something to be restrained, corrected, purified. And the first battleground was the breakfast table. Corn flakes were designed to be bland, intentionally boring. A meal stripped of indulgence. No sugar, no spice, no joy. Because joy, Kellogg believed, led to weakness. He promised parents that this food would protect their children. He promised patients that it would cleanse their bodies. He promised society something even bigger, that a simple bowl of flakes could shape morality itself. And people believed him. Hospitals served it, schools adopted it, families trusted it without hesitation. After all, it came from a doctor, from science, from health. But trust can be dangerous when it goes unquestioned. Behind the clean image of cornflakes was a growing obsession, one that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with control. Food was no longer food. It was ideology. It was authority. It was power. and the breakfast table became a silent classroom where obedience was taught one spoonful at a time. What the public didn't see was the tension simmering behind the scenes, a kitchen not filled with warmth, but with pressure, a process not driven by care, but by rigid belief, and a brother watching quietly as a simple recipe turned into a weapon. Because while America saw cornflakes as harmless, something darker was already forming, not in the bowl, but between the men who made it. The flakes were spreading across the nation, but so was resentment. Credit was being claimed, control was tightening, ideas were being suffocated, and a silent conflict was beginning to rot the foundation of what the world thought was a wholesome invention. No one heard the arguments. No one saw the clenched fists. No one noticed the hatred quietly fermenting beneath the surface. After all, who would ever suspect breakfast? And yet, this was only the beginning, because the same food trusted to nourish families would soon become the spark that destroyed one. And the crunch you hear every morning, that isn't just cereal breaking, it's the echo of something that was never meant to be swallowed so easily. Trust is built slowly. It grows in kitchens, in hospitals, in quiet recommendations passed from doctor to patient, from parent to child. Cornflakes did not conquer the world through force or spectacle. They slipped in gently, carried by reassurance. White coats, medical language, carefully chosen words like clean, simple, healthy. In an age when food was often heavy and unpredictable, cornflakes felt modern, controlled, measured, each flake identical to the next, as if chaos itself had been pressed flat and baked away. People wanted that certainty. They wanted to believe that something as small as breakfast could protect them from a world that felt increasingly out of control. Disease, moral panic, industrial stress, everything seemed connected, and food became the easiest place to draw a line. Eat right, live right. And cornflakes fit perfectly into that promise. But what most people never realized is that this breakfast was not created to nourish joy, strength, or pleasure. It was designed to suppress, to dull, to restrain impulses that its creator feared more than illness itself. John Harvey Kellogg believed the human body was dangerous when left unchecked. He believed desire led to decay, that indulgence, especially physical pleasure, was a sickness spreading through society. And he believed food could be used as a cure, not by giving the body what it wanted, but by denying it. Cornflakes were intentionally tasteless. That wasn't a flaw. It was the feature. Blandness was discipline. Repetition was obedience. Eating became an act of submission rather than enjoyment, and the public applauded. They praised the simplicity. They praised the science. They praised the man who promised salvation through restraint. Few asked questions. Fewer still wanted to hear the answers, because it felt good to trust something so ordinary. But trust can become a blindfold. Behind the clean image of cornflakes, a rigid philosophy hardened into obsession. Kellogg didn't just design a breakfast. He designed a worldview, one where control was virtue and deviation was sin. And once that worldview was accepted at the breakfast table, it didn't stay there. It followed people into their daily lives, into their beliefs, into their families. Food stopped being nourishment and became instruction. Eat this, avoid that, obey. And in the background of this growing influence stood someone rarely mentioned in the early praise, someone whose hands did the work, whose patience refined the process, whose quiet contribution made mass production possible. Will Keith Kellogg. While John spoke to crowds in patience, Will worked with machines and methods. While John shaped ideology, Will shaped reality. He watched cornflakes move from experiment to product, from kitchen curiosity to national phenomenon. And he noticed something unsettling. The cereal was spreading faster than the philosophy could contain it. People weren't eating cornflakes to become pure. They were eating it because it was convenient, because it was cheap, because it tasted good enough. The public didn't care about restraint or moral reform. They cared about breakfast. That difference mattered, because it revealed a crack in the foundation. What John Harvey saw as a moral weapon, Will began to see as a product. A bridge between health and enjoyment. A way to improve, not suppress, human life. But that thought was dangerous. In a system built on control, improvement looks like rebellion. And rebellion, no matter how quiet, is always punished. The breakfast everyone trusted was no longer just food. It had become a battlefield of ideas. On one side, absolute authority masked as health. On the other, a growing realization that people didn't want to be controlled, they wanted to be fed. This tension never appeared on the packaging. It never showed up in advertisements or medical endorsements. It loomed in glances, in disagreements behind closed doors, in recipes altered and rejected. The public continued to pour milk and eat in peace, unaware that the same flakes floating calmly in their bowls were slowly sharpening the knives behind the scenes. Because once trust is established, betrayal hurts more. And Corn Flakes had earned the world's trust completely, which is why what came next would feel less like a disagreement and more like a fracture. A fracture that would split not just a family but the meaning of breakfast itself. Before there was conflict, before there was silence, before there was hatred, there was belief. John Harvey Kellogg and Will Keith Kellogg were brothers not just by blood, but by purpose. In the early days, they stood on the same side of an idea that felt larger than either of them. They believed they could improve the human body. Fix it, guide it, protect it from its own weaknesses. They just disagreed on how. John Harvey was the older brother. Brilliant, charismatic, certain. He spoke with the confidence of a man who never doubted his own righteousness. As a physician and reformer, he believed he had been chosen to correct society's mistakes. His word was not a suggestion, it was doctrine. Will Keith was quieter, observant, methodical. He listened more than he spoke. Where John dreamed in absolutes, Will noticed details. Where John imagined ideals, Will imagined systems that could actually work. Together, they built something remarkable. At the Battle Creek Sanitarium, the brothers shared a vision of health that drew patients from around the world. Politicians, industrialists, celebrities all came seeking cures for bodies worn down by excess and stress. The institution became a symbol of modern wellness, and at its heart was a simple idea: food could heal. John shaped the philosophy. Will made it function. Every day, Will managed kitchens, machinery, staff, supply chains. He refined processes, solved problems, and turned experiments into routines. Without his patience, the sanitarium would have remained an idea instead of an operation. At first, John valued this. But admiration has a limit when it threatens authority. John did not see Will as a partner. He saw him as an extension. A pair of hands, not a voice. The vision in John's mind belonged to him alone. Will was there to serve it, not shape it, and yet the success of their work made that distinction harder to maintain. When the cereal began gaining attention, it didn't carry John's sermons with it. It carried Will's efficiency, his consistency, his understanding of what people would actually eat every day. Patients liked it. Visitors asked for it. Demand grew. And with demand came a question neither brother could ignore. Who does this belong to? John believed ownership was spiritual. He had conceived the idea, therefore he owned its purpose. Any change was corruption. Any improvement was betrayal. Will believed ownership was earned. He had refined the process, scaled the production, solved the problems. Without him, there would be no cereal to argue over. The same vision that once united them now pulled them in opposite directions. John wanted obedience. Will wanted progress. John wanted control. Will wanted growth. What made the conflict inevitable was not money, at least not at first. It was identity. John's sense of self was bound to being the moral authority. Will's sense of self was bound to building something real. Two brothers, one creation, and no room for compromise. Conversations grew colder. Instructions became commands. Praise turned into dismissal. The unspoken rule was clear: Will could work, but he could not decide. And that kind of imbalance never lasts, because when one brother believes he is a prophet and the other realizes he is an architect, eventually the structure cracks. And when it does, belief is no longer enough to hold it together. John Harvey Kellogg did not fear disease as much as he feared desire. To the world, he was a pioneer of health, a respected physician, a man invited to speak, to teach, to lead. His words carried authority, and his white coat made his beliefs feel like science. But beneath that calm, confident exterior lived an obsession that shaped everything he touched. John believed pleasure was the enemy, not metaphorically, literally. He saw the human body as a machine constantly at risk of sabotage by its own impulses: hunger, attraction, excitement. These were not natural experiences to be understood, but threats to be eliminated. And in his mind, food was the most powerful weapon to wage that war. Pleasure weakened discipline. Discipline preserved purity. That belief became his religion. At the Battle Creek Sanitarium, every detail reflected this mindset. Meals were measured, repetitive, stripped of indulgence. Patients were encouraged, sometimes forced to abandon foods that brought comfort or satisfaction. Enjoyment was treated as a symptom of illness, and John was proud of this severity. He believed suffering meant progress. His ideas went far beyond diet. He wrote endlessly about restraint, control, and the dangers of pleasure. He believed bland food could suppress dangerous urges, that denying the body would strengthen the mind, that discomfort was not just acceptable, but necessary. To those who trusted him, this sounded like discipline. To those who lived under it, it felt like punishment. Corn Flakes were the perfect expression of this philosophy. They were dry, uniform, predictable. Nothing about them invited excitement. Eating became mechanical fuel, not experience, exactly as John intended. But this rigid worldview left no room for humanity. There was no flexibility, no curiosity, no compassion for those who lived differently. John's certainty hardened into intolerance, and intolerance became control. Anyone who questioned him wasn't simply disagreeing, they were wrong. Dangerous. Corrupt, including his own brother. Will Keith Kellogg watched this obsession grow with quiet concern. He saw patients who improved physically but felt emotionally drained. He saw staff walking on eggshells. He saw ideas rejected not because they failed, but because they challenged John's authority. Most of all, he saw how Corn Flakes, once a simple experiment, had become a symbol of something darker. What was meant to help people had turned into a tool for enforcing ideology. Will believed food could improve lives. John believed food should discipline them. That difference, subtle at first, became impossible to ignore, because John didn't just dislike pleasure, he resented it. He saw joy as rebellion, and rebellion had to be crushed. This made working alongside him unbearable. Every suggestion from Will was treated as temptation. Every attempt to improve taste or accessibility was labeled moral decay. Even success was suspicious if it wasn't achieved on John's terms. The more popular Corn Flakes became, the more John tightened his grip. He feared that if people enjoyed the cereal, they would miss the point, and if they missed the point, then the entire moral mission would collapse. So he doubled down. No sugar, no change, no compromise. What John never realized or refused to accept was that people don't want to be controlled forever. They can tolerate discipline. They can respect guidance. But when control replaces care, resistance begins quietly. And the quietest resistance often comes from those closest to you. Will did not rebel loudly. He didn't argue in public or undermine his brother openly. He simply began to think differently. To imagine a version of Corn Flakes that didn't punish the body, but nourished it. That thought alone was unforgivable. Because to John Harvey Kellogg, disagreement wasn't just personal. It was sinful. And once morality is weaponized, there is no room left for family. History often pretends that empires are born from grand plans, but more often, they begin with accidents. One night, in a quiet kitchen at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a batch of cooked grain was forgotten. Left too long, overcooked, supposedly ruined. By every rule John Harvey Kellogg believed in, it should have been thrown away. But Will Keith Kellogg didn't throw it out. He rolled it. What came out wasn't dough, it was flakes. Thin, crisp, unexpected. When baked, they held their shape. When eaten, they were light, simple, different. At first, it was just curiosity. A mistake turned experiment. But when the flakes were served, something unusual happened. People liked them, not because they were moral, not because they were disciplined, but because they were easy, familiar, comforting. That reaction mattered. To Will, it was proof that food could be both healthy and human, that nourishment didn't have to feel like punishment, that progress didn't destroy principles, it refined them. To John, it was dangerous. He saw the accident not as innovation, but as temptation. The flakes were never meant to be enjoyed. They were meant to correct, and enjoyment meant failure. Worse, it meant losing control over the message. Still, the demand kept growing. Patients asked for more. Visitors wanted to take some home. Word spread beyond the sanitarium walls. What was once a controlled experiment was slipping into the outside world, and John hated that. He insisted the recipe remain unchanged. No sweetness, no adaptation, no mass appeal. The flakes existed to serve his ideology, not the public's taste. Any deviation would corrupt the mission. Will saw the opposite. He understood something John refused to accept. Once an idea leaves your hands, it no longer belongs only to you. It belongs to the people who use it. And those people were speaking clearly. They wanted cornflakes, but not as a sermon. They wanted breakfast. This was the moment the brothers stopped moving in the same direction. Will began to think like a builder. He imagined factories, distribution, packaging. He thought about consistency, shelf life, affordability. Not to destroy the original idea, but to let it live. John interpreted this as betrayal. Every improvement felt like theft. Every suggestion felt like rebellion. The cereal was no longer just food. It was a test of loyalty. And in John's mind, Will was failing it. Tension crept into every conversation. Decisions became ultimatums. Trust eroded silently. What had once been collaboration hardened into surveillance. John watched Will closely, suspicious of every choice, every adjustment, every quiet success. And then came sugar, just a small addition, meant to balance taste, meant to make the cereal appealing beyond a controlled institution. To Will, it was practical. To John, it was unforgivable. Sugar represented everything John despised: pleasure, indulgence, weakness. Adding it wasn't just changing a recipe, it was rejecting an entire worldview. From that moment on, the conflict was no longer theoretical. It was personal. The recipe that had been created by accident had now become a line in the sand. On one side stood rigid belief. On the other, adaptation and growth. And between them stood two brothers who could no longer pretend they were working toward the same future. Corn Flakes had escaped the kitchen, and with them, the brothers' unity. What followed would not be resolved with discussion or compromise. It would be decided in boardrooms, courtrooms, and silence. And the cereal that once symbolized health would soon symbolize something far more bitter. Because once an idea becomes profitable, belief alone is no longer enough to hold it together. Success has a way of revealing what people truly want to own. As cornflakes spread beyond the walls of the sanitarium, attention followed, praise followed, and slowly, unmistakably, money followed. What had once been a quiet experiment was now something with value, real value. And with value came fear, not of failure, but of losing control. John Harvey Kellogg tightened his grip. He positioned himself as the sole authority, the sole visionary, the sole owner of the idea. In public, he spoke as if cornflakes were the natural extension of his philosophy. In private, he made sure decisions flowed in only one direction, downward, toward Will. Will Keith Kellogg found himself doing more work than ever, yet being acknowledged less. He managed production, handled logistics, solved manufacturing problems, and responded to growing demand. But his role was carefully minimized, his name rarely mentioned, his voice quietly dismissed. This was not accidental. John believed recognition would weaken obedience. If Will began to see himself as an equal, the hierarchy would collapse. And hierarchy to John was sacred. He did not share authority, he delegated it. Reluctantly. Every improvement Will suggested was reframed as interference. Every success he achieved was absorbed into John's narrative. The cereal belonged to John's ideology. Will was just a tool to implement it. And tools are replaceable. The message was subtle but constant. Know your place. But something had changed inside Will. He had seen the cereal succeed not because of strict ideology, but because of practicality. He had watched people enjoy it despite its original intention, and he had tasted quite literally the difference that small changes could make. He began to understand a dangerous truth. The product didn't need John's control to survive. That realization made Will a threat. John responded the only way he knew how, by erasing him. He restricted Will's authority, limited his access, questioned his loyalty. Decisions that once required collaboration now arrived as commands. And the more cornflakes grew, the smaller Will was made to feel. But resentment, when silenced, doesn't disappear. It concentrates. Will started imagining a future beyond the sanitarium. A future where the cereal wasn't shackled to moral doctrine, where improvement wasn't labeled corruption, where innovation wasn't betrayal. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider leaving. That thought alone was an act of rebellion. Because John didn't just see Will as a brother. He saw him as property, as an extension of his mission. And property doesn't walk away. It's controlled, corrected, or punished. The tension between them was no longer hidden. Conversations were clipped. Trust was gone. Their shared past felt like a story belonging to someone else. Corn Flakes had created success, but it had also created a shadow. And in that shadow stood Will, increasingly isolated, watching his work enrich a vision that refused to acknowledge him. Eventually, the choice became unavoidable. Stay and disappear completely, or leave and become the villain in his brother's story. And when Will finally chose to step out of the shadows, he didn't just walk away from a job. He walked straight into war. When families fall apart, they usually do it in private. But when power, money, and pride are involved, the collapse becomes public. Will Kellogg didn't leave quietly. He left with intention. He took everything he had learned, every process refined, every mistake corrected, every insight earned through years of invisible labor. And he built something of his own. A cereal company. This time it wasn't a moral experiment. It was a business. The flakes were improved, sugar was added, packaging was designed to appeal, not instruct. And the public responded immediately. Sales soared. What had been restrained inside the sanitarium now exploded across the nation. Corn Flakes were no longer a lesson. They were a product people loved. Harvey Kellogg watched this happen with disbelief and fury. To him, Will hadn't just left. He had stolen. He had corrupted a sacred idea. He had taken something meant to discipline society and turned it into pleasure. And John could not allow that to stand. The response was swift and merciless. Lawsuits. Brother sued brother. Courtrooms replaced kitchens. Lawyers replaced conversations. The family bond was reduced to legal arguments and bitter accusations. Every document was an attempt to erase the other's claim to the past. John argued that Corn Flakes were his intellectual creation born from his philosophy, his institution, his authority. Will argued that without his work, there would have been nothing to sell. No production, no consistency, no empire. The court didn't care about brotherhood. It cared about ownership. As the case dragged on, something irreversible happened. The last threads of family loyalty snapped. Words once spoken in trust were twisted into evidence. Shared memories became weapons. Silence hardened into hatred, and there would be no reconciliation. The verdict favored Will. He won the rights. He won the company. He won the future of Corn Flakes. But victories like this don't feel like triumph. They feel like exile. John never forgave him. He never spoke to him again. In his mind, Will was no longer a brother. He was a traitor, and traitors deserved nothing but erasure. The lawsuit didn't just divide assets, it divided history. From that point forward, the Kellogg story would be told in fragments, depending on who was speaking and who was being left out. The cereal empire marched on, but the family was finished. Two brothers walked away richer, more famous, and completely alone. And as the legal dust settled, something else began to rise, a monument, not to reconciliation, but to victory. Money changes stories. Once Will Kellogg won control of the cereal, Corn Flakes were no longer trapped in ideology or courtrooms. They were free to become what the public had already decided they were: a staple, a habit, a daily ritual shared by millions. Factories rose. Machines never slept. Trains carried boxes across the country. The name Kellogg's became synonymous with breakfast itself. What had started as a forgotten pot of grain became an empire. Advertisements filled newspapers. Smiling families appeared on boxes. Corn Flakes were no longer bland discipline. They were friendly, reliable, comforting. Breakfast was no longer about control. It was about consistency, and consistency makes fortunes. Will became one of the most successful businessmen of his time. He refined not just cereal, but branding, distribution, and trust. The public didn't care about the feud. They cared about what was on their table every morning. But wealth has a strange echo. Every success reminded Will of the price he had paid. The empire proved him right, but it also made the absence impossible to ignore. There were no family celebrations, no shared victories, only silence where a brother should have been. John Harvey Kellogg faded from public relevance as the cereal grew louder. His rigid philosophy couldn't compete with mass appeal. While Will expanded factories, John retreated further into his beliefs, unchanged, unbending, and increasingly isolated. The empire grew, but the rift deepened. Corn Flakes reached households across continents, yet reconciliation never crossed the distance between two men who once worked side by side. The cereal outlived their arguments. The company outgrew their conflict. But bitterness doesn't vanish with success. It hides in achievements. It hardens in pride. And sometimes, it demands a physical reminder of who won and who was left behind. For Will, that symbol would take the form of stone, wood, and silence. A mansion, not just a home, a statement. When words fail, people build. They build to remember. They build to prove. They build to say what can no longer be spoken aloud. With the fortune earned from Corn Flakes, Will Keith Kellogg commissioned a mansion that would stand apart from ordinary success. It was grand, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Every corridor, every window, every polished surface carried weight beyond comfort. This was not just a home. It was a declaration. The mansion rose from cereal money earned through independence, defiance, and victory in court. It stood as proof that Will had not only survived his brother's control, but surpassed it. Where John demanded obedience, Will created legacy. But legacy built in the shadow of conflict carries a colder meaning. The house was expansive, elegant, and quiet. Too quiet. It wasn't filled with laughter or family gatherings. It didn't echo with shared memories. It echoed with jarred memories. It echoed with distance, with everything that had been lost along the way. Visitors saw wealth. Will saw silence. The mansion became a monument to a life rebuilt without reconciliation. Every room was a reminder that success had come at the cost of family. That triumph didn't heal it, confirmed the fracture. John never set foot inside. He never acknowledged it. In his mind, the mansion represented corruption, excess, everything his philosophy rejected. Where Will saw achievement, John saw moral decay. Two men, two interpretations, one unbridgeable divide. The mansion stood tall, but it could not fill the absence left by a broken bond. It could not replace shared purpose. It could not erase the bitterness that lingered beneath every accomplishment. Because buildings don't forgive, they remember. Stone remembers silence, walls remember anger, and success remembers the price paid for it. The mansion was proof that Will had won the world, but it was also proof that he had lost his brother forever. After the courtrooms emptied and the headlines faded, what remained was silence. Not the peaceful kind, the heavy kind. John Harvey Kellogg and Will Keith Kellogg lived the rest of their lives in separate worlds, both shaped by Corn Flakes, both haunted by it. The invention that once united them had become the permanent distance between them. They never reconciled. No final conversation. No apology. No closure. John retreated deeper into his beliefs. As the world embraced the cereal empire he no longer controlled, he clung to the certainty that had cost him everything. He wrote, lectured, and defended his ideas with the same rigidity that had driven his brother away. To admit fault would have meant admitting his obsession had destroyed his family. He could not do that. Will lived surrounded by success. His company flourished. His name became immortalized in grocery aisles across the world. Yet in moments of quiet, wealth offered no relief from the absence that followed him everywhere. There was no one to share the origin story with, No brother to say, "We built this together." Only echoes. Time passed. Years stacked quietly on top of one another. The world moved on. Breakfast remained routine. Cornflakes continued to crunch beneath millions of spoons, unaware of the silence that gave them life. When death finally came, it did not reunite them. Their legacy remained split, one remembered as the face of a global brand, the other as a rigid reformer whose control cost in relevance. History chose efficiency over ideology, progress over purity, but history rarely asks what it destroys along the way. The Kellogg brothers never stopped influencing the world. They just stopped influencing each other. John Harvey Kellogg did not wake up one morning and decide to hate pleasure. It grew slowly, quietly, like mold in the walls of a house no one thought to inspect, to understand the damage he caused to his brother, to his invention, to himself. You have to understand the fear that lived inside him. A fear so deep that it disguised itself as morality, a fear that convinced him the human body was not something to be trusted. John believed the body was weak, not fragile, dangerous. He saw desire as a threat lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. Hunger could become indulgence. Comfort could become laziness. Pleasure could become corruption, and corruption, in his mind, was the beginning of collapse, not just of individuals, but of civilization itself. This belief did not come from science alone. It came from control. John Harvey Kellogg lived in an era obsessed with order. Society feared chaos, sexuality, excess, independence, and John offered certainty, rules, systems, clean lines between what was acceptable and what was not. People listened because certainty feels safe. At the Battle Creek Sanitarium, his authority was absolute. Patients didn't just follow medical advice, they followed doctrine. What to eat, how to sit, when to sleep, how to think about their own bodies. Pleasure was framed not as a natural human experience, but as a moral failure. And John was convinced he was saving people. That conviction made him dangerous, because when someone believes they are morally superior, compassion becomes optional. Discipline replaces empathy. Obedience replaces understanding. Food, to John, was the perfect tool. Food entered the body daily, quietly, repeatedly. It shaped habits without argument. If he could control what people ate, he could control how they lived and, more importantly, how they felt. Cornflakes were not created to nourish joy. They were created to remove it. The flakes were deliberately bland, uniform, predictable. No surprises, no stimulation. Eating them was meant to feel routine, not rewarding. A reminder that the body existed to be managed, not indulged. John took pride in this. He believed discomfort was proof of discipline. If food didn't excite you, it couldn't tempt you. If it didn't tempt you, it couldn't corrupt you. It was logic built on fear, reinforced by absolute certainty, and certainty does not tolerate disagreement. This is where the fracture with Will became inevitable. Will Keith Kellogg did not reject discipline. He rejected extremism. He understood that health without humanity becomes punishment, that food without pleasure becomes control, that systems built without flexibility eventually break the people inside them. John could not hear this. To him, compromise was weakness. Improvement was contamination. Any suggestion that people might enjoy cornflakes felt like an attack on the very foundation of his worldview, because if people could be healthy and happy, then everything he believed about suffering being necessary would collapse. So he doubled down. He rejected sugar not because it was unhealthy, but because it was pleasurable. He resisted mass appeal not because it was dangerous, but because it removed his authority. He tightened rules not because they worked, but because they kept him in control. And control was the point. John's hatred of pleasure wasn't abstract. It was personal. He feared losing command over bodies, over behavior, over meaning. And when fear becomes ideology, it poisons everything around it, including family. Will was no longer just a brother with ideas. He became a threat to moral order. Every suggestion Will made felt like rebellion. Every improvement felt like betrayal. And John responded not with discussion, but with suppression, limiting Will's voice, minimizing his contributions, reducing him to labor without authorship. This wasn't just professional conflict, it was psychological domination. John needed will beneath him, not beside him. Equality would have forced reflection. Reflection would have forced doubt. And doubt was intolerable. The tragedy is that John genuinely believed he was right. That belief allowed him to sacrifice relationships without remorse, to justify cruelty as discipline, to mistake rigidity for virtue. And when Corn Flakes escaped his control, when they became popular for reasons he didn't approve of, he felt betrayed by the world itself. The cereal was no longer preaching his gospel. It was being enjoyed. That, to John Harvey Kellogg, was failure. In the end, his hatred of pleasure left him with exactly what he believed he deserved: isolation, a life governed by rules so strict they left no room for connection, no room for reconciliation, no room for forgiveness. Corn Flakes lived on. His authority did not. And the irony is devastating. A man who believed pleasure destroyed society ended his life remembered not for health, but for control. And control, once lost, never returns. The breakfast everyone trusts. Every morning before the world fully wakes up, the same quiet ritual begins. A cupboard opens. A bowl touches a table. Milk is poured, and something golden floats to the surface. Corn flakes. They arrive without warning, without ceremony, without fear. They are never questioned. They are never inspected. They are trusted, and trust is the most powerful force in any story. Because what we trust, we stop watching. Cornflakes were never loud. They didn't demand attention. They didn't shock or provoke. They simply existed, calm, clean, reliable. A breakfast that promised safety in a world that felt increasingly unsafe. Parents trusted them. Doctors trusted them. Schools trusted them. Entire generations trusted them. And that trust did not come from taste alone. It came from authority. In the late 19th century, America was restless. Cities were growing. Factories were expanding. Workdays were longer, meals were heavier, and anxiety sat quietly beneath everyday life. Illness spread easily. Moral panic spread faster. People were afraid their bodies were betraying them. Doctors warned that modern life was dangerous, that excess food weakened the body, that indulgence weakened the mind, that pleasure itself might be the enemy of progress. And when fear is widespread, people look for guidance. They look for structure. They look for someone who sounds certain. That certainty arrived wearing a white coat. John Harvey Kellogg was not just a doctor. He was a reformer, a speaker, a man who believed the body was something to be corrected rather than enjoyed. To him, food was not comfort, it was control. He believed what people ate shaped who they became, and that belief would change breakfast forever. Cornflakes were not designed to delight. They were designed to discipline. Bland by intention, uniform by design. A food stripped of indulgence so that desire itself would be muted. This was not accidental. Pleasure, Kellogg believed, led to weakness. Weakness led to moral decay, and moral decay threatened society. So he offered a solution. Not medicine, not punishment, but routine. Eat this every morning. Eat it the same way. Eat it without excitement, and you will be safe. That promise spread quietly, because it felt reasonable, scientific, responsible. Cornflakes were framed as clean food for clean living, a breakfast that removed temptation from the start of the day. And people listened. Hospitals served them. Sanitariums promoted them. Health institutions praised them. Parents placed boxes on kitchen shelves without hesitation, because it wasn't just food. It was reassurance. And reassurance is addictive. What no one noticed, or perhaps no one wanted to notice, was that this breakfast carried an idea, a philosophy that did not stay in the bowl. It followed people into their habits, into their discipline, into their understanding of what it meant to be good. Food stopped being nourishment. It became instruction. Eat correctly. Live correctly. Desire less. And while the nation trusted this quiet revolution, something else was happening behind closed doors. Something far less wholesome, far less calm. Because cornflakes were not born in harmony, they were born in control, and control always creates pressure. Pressure that builds silently, pressure that eventually breaks something. At the Battle Creek Sanitarium, where the cereal first gained attention, the kitchens were not warm places of creativity. They were laboratories, controlled environments governed by rigid belief. Every ingredient was measured, every variation discouraged. This was not a space for experimentation. It was a space for obedience. And yet, innovation still found its way in, not through ideology, but through accident. A forgotten pot, overcooked grain. A mistake that should have been discarded, but it wasn't. What emerged from that mistake would soon sit on millions of breakfast tables, but before it ever reached the public, it created something else: tension. Because behind the trusted image of cornflakes stood two men who did not see the world the same way. Two brothers. One voice spoke loudly to the public. The other worked quietly in the background. One preached certainty. The other observed reality, and while the world learned to trust breakfast, those brothers were beginning to distrust each other. The public saw health. The kitchen felt strain. The cereal was spreading faster than the belief system that created it. People were not eating cornflakes to be pure. They were eating them because they were simple, convenient, familiar. That difference mattered. Because when people stop following an idea for the reason it was created, the creator loses control, and loss of control was the one thing Harvey Kellogg could not tolerate. The breakfast everyone trusted was no longer just food. It was leverage. It was influence. It was power. And power, once tasted, is never easily surrendered. So while America poured milk and started its mornings in peace, something darker was already forming beneath the surface, a conflict hidden behind routine, a fracture disguised as health. A story no one expected to come from a bowl of cereal, because the most dangerous transformations do not announce themselves with violence. They arrive quietly. Every morning, T.W. Birthers, one invention: before there was conflict, before there was bitterness, before there was silence, there was belief. Not shared perfectly, not equally, but close enough to feel like unity. Harvey Kellogg and Will Keith Kellogg did not begin as enemies. They did not wake up one day destined to destroy each other. In the early years, they stood side by side, convinced they were working toward the same future: a healthier world, a disciplined society, a better human being. The difference was subtle at first, so subtle that no one noticed it. Harvey Kellogg was the older brother, charismatic, confident, certain. He spoke as if his ideas had already been proven by history, even when they were still forming in his mind. To those who listened, he sounded like authority. To those who followed, he sounded like truth. He believed leadership meant direction, not discussion. Will Keith Kellogg was quieter, more reserved, less interested in speeches, more interested in solutions. Where John saw systems of belief, Will saw systems of work. Where John imagined how people should live, Will noticed how they actually did. Together, they built the Battle Creek Sanitarium into something extraordinary. To the public, it appeared harmonious, a place where science and discipline merged, where the body could be corrected and the mind purified. Patients arrived hopeful. Visitors left impressed. Behind the scenes, the division of labor was clear. John was the face. Will was the engine. John spoke to crowds, wrote books, and defined philosophy. Will managed kitchens, staff, machinery, and logistics. He solved problems that never made headlines. He refined processes no one applauded. Without Will, the sanitarium would not have functioned, but without John, it would not have been worshipped. And worship mattered to Harvey Kellogg. He did not see himself as a collaborator. He saw himself as a guide, a moral authority placed above the ordinary chaos of human behavior. His certainty was absolute, and certainty does not share space easily. At first, Will accepted this hierarchy. He believed in the mission. He respected his brother's intellect, and he trusted that contribution would eventually lead to recognition. But recognition never came. As the sanitarium expanded, so did the imbalance. Decisions flowed from John downward. Credit followed the same path. Will's work remained invisible, absorbed into the larger narrative of John's vision. And then came Corn Flakes. What began as a minor dietary experiment quickly attracted attention. Patients liked it, visitors asked for it. Demand grew faster than anyone expected. The cereal moved beyond the controlled environment of the sanitarium and into the imagination of the public, and that is where the brothers' differences became impossible to ignore. John saw Corn Flakes as an extension of his philosophy, a tool, a means to discipline the body and suppress desire. To him, the cereal was not a product, it was instruction. Will saw something else. He saw scale. He saw potential. He saw a way to take a simple idea and make it reliable, affordable, and accessible to ordinary people, not as doctrine but as food. This distinction mattered, because once something becomes scalable, it stops being personal. And John Harvey Kellogg did not want to lose personal control. Every suggestion Will made was practical: improve consistency, refine texture, adjust preparation, consider distribution. These were not ideological challenges. They were functional ones. But John heard them differently. To him, practicality sounded like compromise, and compromise sounded like corruption. If cornflakes became enjoyable, they would lose their moral purpose. If people ate them for pleasure, they would miss the lesson. And missing the lesson was unacceptable. So John resisted. He insisted the cereal remain unchanged, bland, rigid, purposefully uninspiring. The flakes were not meant to compete in a market. They were meant to enforce discipline. Will felt the tension immediately. He watched opportunity being deliberately limited, watched demand being restrained, watched innovation labeled as threat. And slowly, quietly, he began to understand the truth. They were no longer building the same thing. John was building authority. Will was building infrastructure. John wanted obedience. Will wanted sustainability. This difference did not erupt into open conflict at first. It manifested as hesitation, as delays, as quiet frustration. Decisions stalled. Conversations grew shorter. Trust thinned. And yet the world outside did not slow down. Interest in cornflakes continued to grow. People wanted them beyond the sanitarium. They wanted them in homes, in schools, in stores. The cereal was escaping its ideological cage, and John felt it slipping. The more popular cornflakes became, the more he feared losing control over their meaning. The cereal was being consumed without context, without instruction, without reverence. It was becoming ordinary. To John Harvey Kellogg, that was a failure. To Will Keith Kellogg, it was success. This was the moment when belief stopped being shared. Two brothers still stood under the same roof, but they no longer looked in the same direction. One stared backward, guarding ideology. The other looked forward, imagining growth, and between them stood a cereal that no longer cared who created it. Because once an idea proves useful, it stops asking permission. The tragedy of the Kellogg brothers is not that they disagreed. It's that they believed disagreement could be controlled. They were wrong, because when vision and reality collide, someone must bend, and John Harvey Kellogg never bent.